Speaking of issues we may or may not have with conservatives, especially with the election happening right now, let's talk about PraguerU. Because PraguerU made a video recently called Why Do You Hate Conservatives? And I feel like arguing with it because I'm in a healthy headspace. Why not? First one we have here is from Nami the Neko. Said, my husband got me a drawing tablet as an early Christmas gift, and I've been wanting to draw some fan art since. Couldn't figure out what to draw, so I finally just decided it didn't need to be anything special or unique. I just drew Slime Suris doing a blep. This is just the work in progress, because I need to go to bed. So I plan on coloring it tonight. I hope you enjoy. It is adorable, Nami. The next one we have here is from Emicat. First time submitting my fan art. I've never been super into drawing, but I had a stroke last month and decided to try it now that I've regained some use in my hand. I'm sorry about that, Emicat. Inspired by Raz's tomato soup, I spent my time watching the stream drawing slime soup. Aw. The last one we have here is also from Emicat as a bonus, laundry slime. I can't escape laundry. I just can't, can I? Anyways. As always, thank you all for your fan art submissions. If you want your fan art to be shown off in a future video, the best way to do so is to drop into the fan art section of Discord. With that said, if you haven't subscribed already or hit the bell notification icon, please consider doing so. Also, we are currently sponsored by Mech Arena. There's a link in the description if you want to help with the channel by doing stuff where that is concerned. That's as far as I'm going to show them. Let's get into the actual video. Why do you hate conservatives?
Because you don't really hate me.
Let's see here.
Why do you hate conservatives? Well, let's not say hate. Let's say dislike, because you don't really hate anyone.
Anubian? Why? Why? You could have chose anything. You chose violence. Why? 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 Fine. God fucking damn it. Anyway, Anubian for the 50,001 channel points. Ooh. There. You happy now? Anyways, thank you very much, Axolotls with Cream, for being on the right side of history. Oh, well. And Ivana Dragmeyer with There we go. Every single one of you got what you wanted, and the only one who suffered was me. Anywho, let's fucking go.
You may dislike them because they want to ban abortion. Conservatives say they're all for freedom, but when it comes to a woman's freedom to choose what she wants to do with her own body, they sing a different tune.
Yeah? It's amazing that PraguerU got it all in one. Tales of Atonement, thank you very much for the follow. But yeah, no, it's kind of weird that they got everything right all at once without skipping a beat. Can we add a couple of other things on there? So typically, if we're talking conservatives, I don't give a shit about conservatives. I don't. I give zero fucks about people who say they are conservative, either socially or fiscally, because 99% of the time, those people don't know what the fuck they're talking about. Like the person who says, I'm actually socially liberal, but I'm fiscally conservative. What the fuck does that mean? Because if you're fiscally conservative and you support the things that the Conservative Party wants, then that tends to end up hurting the social groups that you tend to support because of that liberal side of you. So when people describe themselves as conservative, when people describe themselves that way, I don't tend to give a shit. Because they don't tend to know what they're talking about. Politicians, on the other hand, we'll call them Republican politicians, because that's what they are in the United States. Politicians, on the other hand, I do have an issue with, because of this freedom to choose shit. But let's add a couple things onto here. Why not? Let's preempt PraguerU. I've not watched the video, but let's preempt them real quick. And let's talk about some of the other things they tend to not like that we, might tend to enjoy. One of them being trans rights. Trans rights specifically being the rights for consenting parents and children to have access to puberty blockers, no different than a breast cancer patient would in the exact same scenario. Let's talk about another thing here. Oh, yeah, we're on trans rights again. The ability for people to get gender-affirming care in any which way that medical authorities deem appropriate. That would be a thing that I think should be easier for people to get, as opposed to being stonewalled in various scenarios. Oh, and one of the ways that they're stonewalled is usually because of health care. So let's talk about health care. I'm not a big fan of people saying that we should pay for our own health care. No, I don't believe that. I believe that if we pay taxes, there are certain communal goods that we should get from paying those taxes. I don't think it should stop at education and roads. I believe it should continue on to higher education and weird, nitpicky things like law enforcement and fire safety and, what's this last one here on the list? All right, healthcare, and even maybe a little bit for food. I feel like if a portion of our dollars are already being siphoned away, instead of paying politicians ludicrous amounts of money, maybe we should be spending that money not lining their pockets, but instead making life better for all of us. Would be pretty good, would be pretty useful, in my opinion. Conservative politicians tend to be against that, or against really any form of universal basic income. Anything that benefits people as opposed to benefiting their particular type of preferred person. Anything that benefits us all on the whole, I tend to not be super big on. Oh, by the way, I'm also not a big fan of how Republican politicians tend to be against gay marriage, because that just feels stupid to me. No, it legitimately just feels stupid. There is no mechanical difference between a gay relationship and a heterosexual relationship. Absolutely zero. Even the concession that, one of them can have kids and the other can't have kids, that one doesn't work for me either, because there are plenty of heterosexual couples who don't have kids or are otherwise infertile. So if that's not an actual criteria for heterosexual couples, then it shouldn't be a criteria for gay couples, because there are plenty of ways in which gay couples can have kids, either via adoption, which is a net good for all of us, or via things like in vitro or other forms of surrogacy, or what have you. The point I'm making, the ultimate end goal I'm getting to here, is that I tend to not be a huge fan of Republican politicians, because the policies Republican politicians tend to support are ones that unilaterally hurt our society. And I've given examples here. There are plenty more I could find as well, like deregulation of particular industries that are literally regulated for the sake of keeping us safer. See the, food industry as an example. But okay, let's continue.
You may dislike them because they oppress people of color and deny the fact that America is systemically racist.
I don't care if somebody denies the fact that America is systemically racist. I mean, they're wrong, but I care about policy. I care about the things they do. And I've given a list of things they do that I'm not a fan of.
Conservatives say that everybody is equal regardless of race, and that racism has little to no effect on the daily lives of people of color.
Except it kind of does. And it doesn't have to have an effect on your daily life for it to have an ultimate effect on the outcome of your life, but,
So, they just ignore the issue altogether. You may dislike them because they don't believe in climate change.
Yeah, I tend to not be a big fan of politicians who are in positions of power and who are influenced by corporate lobbies, and who do not instigate policy that can help reverse the damage we've done to our world, because later generations have to live with that damage. I care less about their belief, and I care more about the policies they institute.
Scientists keep telling us we're overheating the planet, and conservatives don't seem to care. They're more concerned about profits than people.
Yeah? Again, first minute of the PraguerU video, and they're actually summing a little bit of this up decently okay. Not particularly articulately well, but, you know, it's not the worst.
But what good is money if you have no planet to spend it on? You may dislike them because they're obsessed with guns.
I also like guns. I'm wondering for what are they gonna do? What are they gonna? When's the turn? When's the heel turn? Come on.
How are we ever going to stop gun violence if we don't get guns off the streets? And how are we ever going to get guns off the streets if conservatives block every common sense gun law? You may dislike them because they're so intolerant.
How many of
What's
these
the harm
do
of
you
calling
have?
somebody by their preferred pronouns?
There is no harm in that. There literally is no harm in that one. That one, there is no harm in calling somebody by their preferred pronoun. I'm sorry. Like, a preferred pronoun is a name. It's the same thing.
Why can't conservatives just show some compassion instead of obsessing over every kind of behavior they don't like? You may dislike them
Oh my god! When are you going to get to the point? How many of these straw men do you have to pull up?
because if they got their way, they'd get rid of democracy and establish an authoritarian theocracy.
I mean, Matt Walsh literally calls himself a theocratic fascist. Whether that's in jest or not, I point you to Poe's law. It doesn't fucking matter.
Bye-bye separation of church and state.
That one's already been going away. The Supreme Court, which is incredibly conservative, has already started making that wane. I'm not certain where the punchline is supposed to be there when that one already happened.
Hello, fascism.
You can't even define that word, but I can.
After all that, you might sum up conservatives with one word. Ugh. If any of this resonates with you, I get it. I've been there. But, and this surprised me, I found they actually have reasons for thinking the way they do.
Ma'am? So does every human being that has ever existed. Every human being that has been well-meaning but wrong has had reasons for thinking the way they do. I don't give a shit that you have reasons for thinking the way that you do. I give a shit about whether or not you're correct. And it turns out, 9 times out of 10, they're not. Alpha Mario X, thank you for the raid.
Here are some of them. On abortion. To start, we can agree that no one likes abortion.
Actually, no, I love abortion. I love the idea of a woman being able to just aim her cervix at somewhere and fire out a fetus cannon. I think that's wonderful. I think it's incredibly progressive. And I think that the smear that is left on the wall afterwards is a work of art. I think it's just a work of art. 10 out of 10. 110%. It's up to you whether or not what I just said is parody.
But there is a clear divide on the issue. Progressives focus their attention on the mother. Conservatives, while they have compassion for the mother,
No, they don't.
focus their attention on the baby.
So, basically, the conservatives focus on the potential person that doesn't exist yet, whereas the progressives focus on the real person that's there. There's another issue that this happens in. You know, where the opinions of progressive people on gay marriage is one thing, and it's based on real people who want to get married, and the opinions of conservatives is based on a god that may or may not exist. It's almost like this advocating for the person who isn't really there is kind of a common thread. A really weird common thread.
They see a human being growing in a mother's womb as innocent and vulnerable.
And funny.
Those babies deserve to be protected, since they obviously can't protect themselves.
I mean, yes, bullets do need a good casing, you're right. But, you know, after it's fired out, it's fine. That can go in a million directions. It's a hollow point.
On racism, conservatives don't deny that racist people exist, but when it comes to the narrative of systemic racism, conservatives are unconvinced.
Okay.
Of course, there are disparities in this country, but why assume that these disparities are because of racism?
So, fun fact. Really cool thing about CRT. We use CRT to determine, CRT being critical race theory, we use that to determine when racism happened at a point in time and the impact that it potentially had going forward. So if we look at districts that are redlined, right? We look at places that are redlined and we see that the families that are in different gentrified divides there tend to be divided on racial lines. We ask ourselves why that is. It seems like a really weird circumstance until you consider that about 100 years ago, those lines were actually written on lines of race. And we are still feeling the effects of them today. The fact that there are people alive today that lived under Jim Crow laws still, you would think awkward if politicians are still alive right now who were alive during Jim Crow, wouldn't it just, for sake of argument, be likely that one or two of them, maybe a handful of people even, actually still think we should go back to some of those? I mean, after all, it was a bitch and a half to get those laws taken away. It's not like everybody in America magically changed sides at the last second. It's not like everybody in America magically changed their opinions on a whim. It's not like racism randomly got defeated and then it disappeared. And moreover, I believe it's naive to think that nobody who has ever been elected to a position of power has not utilized race in any of their decision-making ever. And if that is not part of systemic racism, as those politicians are literally the puppeteers behind the system we live in, I don't know what to tell you.
Good schools, good parents, good habits, and good communities would go much further toward alleviating poverty and expanding opportunity than a lifetime of racial justice movements.
All right, let's take a look at these real quick. So, good schools. Good schools. I have a problem with this one. How do we have good schools? I talked about redlining, right? So, good schools are usually well-funded schools. Well-funded schools happen because the local housing taxes pay for the schools. If areas that have been previously redlined are still very racially divided, and therefore the schools in those areas still severely underfunded, then what you will have is primarily black schools that are underfunded. I know this because I grew up in Montclair, in Pensacola. And while I had the opportunity of going to a Christian private school, several of my friends went to Montclair, and we definitely exchanged stories about the very different learning environments we were in and the different tools we had access to. As for loving families, that's an interesting one, considering that the GOP, really the United States government in general, but the GOP, is responsible for the drug war in all of its various incarnations since the time of Nixon. And the drug war is one of the main reasons why you don't have as many stable families in impoverished neighborhoods, because one of the avenues out of poverty is utilizing that black market. So wait a minute. It feels like at least two of these are completely based on things that the GOP has had direct hands in. And if we go to that last one, the community. If the community that you're raised in is a community that it's harder to keep parents around in, it's harder for people to survive in, and it's harder for people to get better education in, then you're going to end up with a community that always looks the same. And I don't mean that on the basis of race. I mean that on the basis of the amount of people who have college education, the amount of people who have higher paying jobs, the amount of people who are able to raise up other people in their community. If that is constantly stonewalled because we have not taken enough affirmative action to fix those first two issues you mentioned, then you can say, oh, well, if we just had good schools. Okay, well, why don't we have good schools? Because schools are funded by public housing. or schools are funded by housing taxes. Schools funded by housing taxes don't tend to perform well when the housing taxes themselves are so low because they're in impoverished areas. Well, why are they impoverished? Well, because they've been classically housing racial minority groups. Why have they been classically housing racial minority groups? Oh, wait! CRT gave us that answer ages ago. We redlined them 100 years ago, and we've only had a handful of generations since then. It's really weird. It's really strange when you can actually take the arguments they're making and throw them in their face based on the shit that has actually happened in reality.
Poverty and expanding opportunity than a lifetime of racial justice movements.
Racial justice movements. I want to talk about these for a second. So, the purpose of a racial justice movement is to bring attention to these disparities. A racial justice movement doesn't fix shit. By and large, it doesn't. Policy fixes shit. But what racial justice movements do is they force society to train their eyes on the problems that they have otherwise been avoiding. I talked about the fact that I went to Pensacola Christian Academy and friends of mine went to Montclair. I would not have known what the bus environment was for those kids. I would not have known what the learning environment was for those kids. I would not have known any of that had I not had the opportunity to have friends who had that lived experience. Otherwise, I would have maintained the exact same standard for myself wherever I went. Oh, I had this kind of education. You must have had it too. Despite the fact that I was learning algebra at age... Fuck, it was in 3rd grade. I was learning it super early compared to public school. I was learning cursive first. I never learned how to do print. I had a very different education than most people do in their first few years because that's how PCA operated. I would never have known that that was outside the norm had I not had access to conversation with people who lived inside the norm for my area. Racial justice movements are attempts at educating people on the norm, or at the very least, attempts to force people to realize the world is not perfect, the world is not stable, the world is not yet in a place where we can all rest collectively. It makes people think. No, a racial justice movement does not change public policy, but it forces voters to think about public policy for once in their damn lives. And when they start thinking about that public policy, politicians are forced to decide what voter base they are going to go for. And if the voter base wants things to change politically for racial minority groups because they have had their eyes trained on them because of those movements, then guess what? Wang bang, public policy has to change or those politicians lose their jobs.
By the way, these rules apply to everyone, regardless of skin color. On climate change, conservatives have very little faith in computer models that have been inaccurately predicting disaster for nearly half a century.
So it's not so much that those models are predicting disaster, they're predicting that, hey, actually, no. Let's be honest. Let's be honest. Humans have technology. We have a very wonderful ability to adapt to many environments. Think about this. The world is heating up. We have air conditioning. People who live most of their time in either an air-conditioned office or an air-conditioned home, 9 times out of 10 are not going to consider the outside heat if they don't have to interact with it. You know who does have to interact with it, though? The ecosystem. The ecosystem has to deal with that increasingly high rate of temperature. And it gets worse and worse. And the apologetics for why it's totally not happening are always rather bullshit. We get snow one year and people go, global warming, am I right? As if snow was randomly going to stop just because the world is heating up. Snow is still a thing that's going to happen because the circumstances to make snow are just, do you have clouds? Is there some fucking dirt in the air? Is the temperature freezing? Is it not so below freezing that we can have these come down to something other than hail? Okay, cool, boom! You're gonna have your snow, and you're gonna have your dumb apologetic for why the world is totally not heating up, despite us being able to look at trends over the last 20 to 30 years to see that no, in fact, we are burning our world. Computer models that have been inaccurately predicting disaster for nearly half a century, if we take that at face value, I will grant that 100%, because I do not know about those individual models. I couldn't name one, but I can tell you for the past half a century, things have been heating up. The general trend in the world has been getting hotter and hotter. And we know that we have a direct effect on this shit because we burned a hole in our own ozone and then patched it up by getting rid of a particular chemical in aerosols. We know the impact that we have. And there are places like ExxonMobil that have made it a point to sell us bunk studies saying that we are not heating up the world with shit like industrial fossil fuel. And yet, we know we are. Now, before somebody tries to say, hey, you're hypocritical, you actually use a car. Yes, I do. Cool. Cars account for 10 to 13% of carbon emissions. Big dollar industry, manufacturing plants, they account for 50 to 60% of them. I'm not a hypocrite, and neither are you, for using a goddamn car. We could be powering the world in a much better way if we moved away from fossil fuel primarily and coal primarily into things like nuclear, and then green energy where we can help it. But people freak the fuck out about that. Despite the fact that nuclear power is literally just steam. And I'm dead fucking serious. It's radioactive rods, cooled down by water, and then the steam from the water making contact with the rods going up into turbines. And then boom, you have power. That's what radioactive power is. You're scared of the equivalent of a boiling kettle.
Conservatives have a lot of faith, however, in human ingenuity to overcome climate. What is air conditioning but a human adaptation to the environment?
Yes. Our adaptation is not a good excuse. Our adaptation makes us more comfortable, but if we cut a hole in the ozone big enough, no amount of air conditioning is going to save us. I'm sorry.
See Miami or Phoenix for further reference. This is not to say we should simply do nothing. Nuclear power, for example, holds so much promise as a renewable and safe energy source.
I have to agree with PraguerU. I have to agree with PraguerU on this one. And anybody in my comment section who wants to say something bad about nuclear energy, you are more than willing to. You are more than able to. It's okay to be wrong in my comment section. Believe me, I need something to laugh at when I am taking a shit. I am not just going to say PraguerU is wrong about everything they ever say. If they say something correct, when they say something correct, I'm going to give it to them.
Conservatives don't understand why environmentalists oppose it.
And neither do I. I think it's just fear-mongering. I'm going to be perfectly honest. I think it's just fear-mongering. Like, green energy is a goal that we should be pushing to. But in the meantime, replacing all of our coal plants with nuclear plants, we won't be able to get them replaced in time to reverse the great amount of damage we've already done to our environment. But anything's better than nothing.
It makes them skeptical and suspicious that the real agenda behind the environmentalist movement is not saving the planet, but giving more power to the government to control people's lives.
Or it's just misinformation. I seriously doubt that a handful of hippies dancing around at Woodstock are trying to be part of a secret government cabal to make us be more controlled by your New World Order fucking totalitarian bullshit. I think it's more that people are misinformed. That's what I think it is. Like, almost 110%, I think it is people being misinformed.
On guns, we all want to live in a safe society. This is why firearms are regulated in every state. But we know bad guys will always find a way to get guns. See Chicago and Baltimore for
So, Chicago and Baltimore. I love when they bring these places up. The reason that Chicago and Baltimore have gun issues is the same reason that places like Canada have more gun issues closer to the border for between Canada and America than in the north. I mean, aside from the fact that it's freezing fucking cold and nobody can be fucked to go and do a shooting. But it also comes down to the fact that if you ban guns in a single location, and there are other locations around that location where one can find guns more easily, importing the guns into the location where they are banned is super easy. Also ignoring the fact that we can 3D print some firearms to some degree of success. Not great, and not to an amazing degree of success, but we can do it. It's a thing that we technically can manage. If you would like to mitigate access to firearms in places like Chicago, then what you need to do is you need to hit the surrounding areas. You need to hit everywhere, basically. So Stryker says, maybe I'm wrong, but what should we do with the waste that the nuclear plants generate? We already have solved that problem. We as a society already have experts who are in the field who work in nuclear waste disposal. We already do that. Like that's already that's already a solved issue. Let's also ignore the fact that, like, in the worst case scenario, you know, we can launch shit into space. But yeah, no. We throw shit underground and we encase it so that as it decays, it does not infect surrounding areas. What about people who freak out about nuclear meltdowns? I have no time to deal with people who panic about every possibility. I have no time for those people. Oh my god, what about the worst possible scenario happening? You're right, the worst possible scenario could happen. I could ride my bike outside and get hit by a car, or get mauled by a deer. The worst possible scenario is possible. I don't give a shit. I care about likelihood. I care about data. I care about the amount of chances that there are for it to happen. If they are unilaterally low, or can be mitigated, then I stopped caring. For the same reason that I will go outside, despite the fact that if I go down to Atlanta, yes, a piano could be dropped on me from a 20-story building, and I could die. That is a possibility. That is a thing that can happen there. The likelihood is low. The worst possible scenario always has a non-zero chance of happening in your life. It is your job to determine how much you let that control you. And I know my background is the wrong one. I forgot to change it to the autumn one for the zoom-ins. It's fine. Alpha Mario says, sirs, if you ride your bike, you can get crushed by a meteor that is 10 kilometers wide. I could also go out into the city and have the first episode of Dead Like Me happen, and then get killed by a toilet seat. Like, that is also a possibility. Like, I don't find much use in living my life based on what the worst possible scenario is when I go out and do stuff. I care more about just existing and letting what happens happen. If that's death, then I guess I die. I don't have that much control over that. So I'm just going to operate as if that's not going to happen anytime soon. I get to live a much more fulfilling, much more happy life that way.
further reference. That's why conservatives want guns, to protect themselves from the bad guys. It's not much more.
How do you tell who's a bad guy? I'm just curious. How do you tell who a bad guy is in any given situation? Like, I agree that... I do agree that people should be allowed to have gun ownership, guns in the United States. I agree with that. I have a gun. However, how do you identify the bad guy with a gun? If a person has started a shootout, and a person has pulled out a gun to stop that person, and then a third person pulls out their gun, how does that third person tell who's the bad guy? How do they figure that out? Let's say the bad guy is dressed just like you and me, and they have walked out with a handgun. How do you tell? How do you stop the bad guy with the gun when you can't identify the bad guy with the gun? That's a logistics thing. What I'm saying is don't try to be a fucking hero.
More complicated than that. On tolerance, conservatives see tolerance as a two-way street. If someone demands to be addressed by certain pronouns and considers it intolerant if you don't comply, conservatives wonder why that isn't intolerant.
It's not. Okay, look. I understand that you're a very upset man. I get it. I understand that you're trying very hard to look like a woman, but you're a very upset man, and I'm not going to call you by anything else because that would be lying to you. Oh, wait! If I were to do that in civil conversation, that would be fucking rude. It's really strange how that works. Misgendering is a dumb thing to do to people. I think it's a wonderful thing to do as a bit of defensive weaponry, but it's a general bullshit thing to do to someone because it's the equivalent of them saying, hey, my name is Tim. Actually, you look like a Bob. I'm going to call you Bob. No, my name is Tim. Shut up, Bob. I know your name's Bob. Assuming that you know more about them, that you know more about who they are, is bullshit. And if you want to say, well, they're not asking the right way, I'm sorry, but the civility politics doesn't get us anywhere. If you start out the conversation by not being respectful, then all hands are off. We don't care. Asking for a basic level of respect is not intolerant. Like, that's not how that is. It's intolerant if somebody says, address me by this, or I'll hurt you, or I'll do some type of repercussion to you. But merely demanding the respect, that's not intolerance. That's just being human in a society. Maybe 2 years of lockdown under COVID has had most of the people at PraguerU forget what that's like, but in a civilized society, we address each other how we prefer.
Why are a conservative's moral or religious beliefs less worthy of respect than anyone else's?
So, let's see here. Here's the reason. Your religious beliefs have zero effect on me because I don't share your religion. I don't have to respect yours or anyone else's religious beliefs. I do, out of courtesy, especially because I have friends who are religious. But when it comes to them making decisions about me, my name, my gender, my status, and them using their religion as a bludgeon for it, I don't have to give a shit about that, and neither do you.
Than anyone else's. On authoritarianism, whenever conservatives win political power, they're typically trying to cut taxes and regulations, make the government smaller, and bolster constitutional freedoms like that of speech and religion.
No, that's not what typically happens here in the States. When you say cut taxes and regulations on businesses are not bad things. They are good things. Again, I want to point you out to the food industry and how regulations have literally made that infinitely safer for us to consume product from. On taxes, when taxes are increased, typically they are not increased on the bottom 50% of us. Typically, they are increased on people who are making six-figure salaries. Most Americans are not making six-figure salaries. And the way taxes work is if you're being taxed more on a six-figure salary, and it starts when you start making a six-figure salary, then you're only getting that increased tax on every dollar you make in the threshold of that six-figure salary. That means if you're taxed at 12% for your first $20,000, you're not taxed at 24% for those first $12,000. If I say, hey, you make $100,000, that means you get taxed at 24%. That doesn't mean that you make 24% of $100,000. That means your first $20,000-ish dollars, you make you take 12% off of that. Your next $20,000-ish dollars, you maybe have 15% taken off of that for taxes. Your next $20,000, 18% is taken off for taxes. Do you see what this means? This means that even if we increase the arbitrary number on taxes, most people do not feel it. Most people do not feel those taxes because those taxes happen on what we can generously call surplus money. Making the government smaller. No. Literally, the conservatives that have been elected to the Supreme Court have done everything against making the government smaller. Regulations have been increased on various people. And usually, when they're making the government smaller, they're doing it by cutting federal funding to public assistance programs, or one of the more fun ones, cutting rights that people have earned, like the right to marry, away from people that are, say, gay, because when they do that, they're technically making the government smaller. There's fewer things the government is responsible for, but you're just making people suffer with that. I don't see the whole, idea that government equals bad. I don't understand it, because ultimately we build the government. We are the ones that make the government what it is. We don't have as much power over it as we should have, but ultimately it's a monster of our own design. Also, bolstering constitutional freedoms like that of speech and religion. What does that mean? When you mean making it to where certain types of hate speech are actually allowed, so that it's easier to fester white nationalists and Nazis in the United States, then I guess under a very loose definition of that, you're technically correct. Technically, on the loosest technicality, but having that arbitrary legal freedom actually strips people of their unilateral freedom. Because when you enable and bolster those groups, it is much harder for people who are outside of those groups to have a voice without losing their safety. Constitutional rights like religion. What religious rights are you fighting for that the Satanic Temple can't fight back with?
That doesn't sound very authoritarian, does it? Progressive policy almost always raises taxes
on people who aren't you,
expands regulations,
which isn't a bad thing,
increases the size of government,
which is a vapid statement and doesn't mean anything on its own without any context,
and now curtails free speech,
which, again, doesn't mean anything without context. I also really like the picture that is used here. We have the literal one that was used in Hitler's propaganda. Great.
To a conservative, that sounds authoritarian.
'Cause they're dumb.
Well, now that you've heard a few of their arguments, do you dislike conservatives less than you did before?
No, not really. And that stupid face won't make me think any differently. I'm sorry, but every argument that was given here was vapid and without any actual context. They were meant to be arguments that can be internalized very, very quickly and very easily by people without them actually educating themselves on what they meant. This is a very common tactic in propaganda, by using suggestion and being vague so that people can fill in the blanks with whatever they want, whatever they feel like. When you say free speech means something different to me than it means to you. But we might both value free speech. But again, what we call free speech may be very different. As a result, when we are listening to a video like this, when we're going over something like this, you have to ask yourself, what are they telling you versus what are they not telling you, and hoping you'll fill in the blanks on. But that's enough of that video. For my part, I'm tired. And doing 2 PraguerU videos in just as many days is certainly more than I anticipated being able to handle. But I'm going to know what you guys think in the comment section below. Let me know what you think. Let me know how you felt. Let me know if maybe there's something I missed or got wrong. I want to know your opinions there. But as always, everybody, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you haven't already. And as always, everyone, insert end of video tagline here.